some of the audit compliance requirements around the single audits that should be so fun and exciting for everyone. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Vincent, and we're going to take us through kind of the background of the Provider Relief Fund and some of the issues around the different distributions. So Vincent?
Thank you, Chad. And I do appreciate the opportunity to get to chat with everyone today. We're going to go through these. Some of this stuff you may be aware of, some you may not. It's good background information just to sort of understand where all this came about, and we'll talk about some things that will be addressed later on in the presentation, specifically things like the CFDA numbers, single audits, those types of matters. But first of all, what are the CARES Act funds? What are we talking about here? And it is the Coronavirus Aid, Relief, and Economic Security. In case you were ever wondering what CARES stood for, that's it: Coronavirus Aid, Relief, and Economic Security. And that's really to help providers, families, workers in dealing with the pandemic, which has been going on, I know, a lot longer than any of us ever suspected back last mid-March when this whole thing got started. We thought maybe a couple of weeks. I know when we were in a out-of-town conference, we're like, well, we'll go home for a couple of weeks and everything will settle down. And here we are over a year later, and we're hoping things are starting to settle down, but gone on a lot longer than we anticipated. But as part of the support for, like we said, the families, workers, and healthcare providers, HHS is distributed, or is in the process of distributing, $178 billion to hospitals and other healthcare providers. So quite a bit. And, given some of the information coming out of the administration, that 178 might be going up even more. They're talking about giving more money out to providers. So stay tuned for that. But who gets it? Who are the actual recipients of these CARES Act funds? So they would be qualified providers of healthcare services and support, all the different types of providers. And we'll talk in a minute about how they were staged, who initially got the money, and then how they staged that and rolled it out to a broader set of providers as time went on. And then the critical thing here is these distributions do not need to be repaid to the government, assuming you comply with the terms and conditions. And when I say they don't need to be repaid, as opposed to the Medicare advance funds, right? The advance payments, when you got those, the agreement was they were paying you up front or in advance, and that you would ultimately need to repay those. In this case, these distributions are not required to be repaid unless you cannot justify their entire use, right? Which is what we're all going through, and Chad's going to address some of that a little later as to how do you justify the use of those funds through the lost revenue calculations and the incremental expenses. But the initial distribution was not anticipated to be repaid. I want to draw your attention to the last two sections on the right side of the screen, the CFDA and the single or financial audit. The CFDAs, that is the specific numbers for these grants. You'll see 498 is provider relief funds, 461 is COVID-19 testing for the uninsured, and 697 is COVID-19 testing for rural health clinics. Those are the main CFDAs or grant numbers that were distributed. I will make sure you understand there are also a lot of providers that got indirect. These are more direct grants to providers. A lot of providers also got some indirect distributions or grants through the state. In other words, the state got a certain distribution from the federal government, and then the state turned around and passed that on through to providers. And that's important to understand. Those will have different CFDA numbers, but they will, as Carla gets into talking about the single audits or financial audits, it's going to be important to understand that those indirect pass-throughs from the states or counties or other agencies is going to be important to track that, because that's going to have an impact on your reporting and potentially the last section, which is the audit. When we talk about you have to have an audit if you had $750,000 or more expended in the current year or in the fiscal year. And that's important to understand because that includes both direct and indirect, right? So you may have gotten $600,000 in direct PRF money, but you may have gotten another $200,000, $300,000 in indirect pass-throughs, and that might end up throwing you over that $750,000 threshold. So it's important to understand exactly what you're getting and where you're getting it from. Chad, you want to advance to the next slide? So the general distributions, and we'll talk about general versus targeted. First of all, we've got the general distributions, and they're in various phases. The first phase was the $50 billion, and many of you probably woke up one day back in April of last year and found out, you had a significant amount of money showing up in your bank statement that you didn't even expect, right? That was some of the initial $30 billion that was shipped out to providers. And really, what the purpose of that was to respond quickly to the needs as the pandemic continued to rage and create significant operational and financial challenges for providers. There was a concerted effort on the part of the government to make sure that you had the funding that you needed to keep the doors open and to treat this surge in capacity. So the initial distributions, they just showed up and they based it on, who was billing for Medicare fee-for-service in the prior year, in this case, 2019, and provided those funds to you directly. There was also an additional $20 million that was based on revenues from CMS cost report data and submissions to the provider portal. So that in total added up to the $50 billion. And then as you started moving into phase two, that was more of a application basis. You had to submit an application into the portal, and that also made, whereas before it was just Medicare fee-for-service Parts A and B, which were mostly hospitals. Phase two started broadening that out to include Medicaid, CHIP, dental providers, and other providers who missed out on the phase one distribution. So they were trying to cover a broader base of providers, because all providers, let's face it, were impacted by this, right? It was not just hospitals, it was all providers, especially those like dental providers and other outpatient providers that for a lot of states, there was mandated closures and things like that. So that created obviously a significant drain on operational and financial performance. And then finally in phase three, which some of you are still waiting on your payments. I know, again, application based, but we're aware of some providers that still have not gotten their phase three distributions, and HHS has said that they are in the process of trying to make good on all of those distributions. It's just taking a while, obviously. But they were also made available to Medicaid, CHIP, dental providers, and then you'll see also assisted living facilities, behavioral health, and other previously ineligible providers. And this is the one in phase three. You might also know it as tranche three, where applicants not receiving 2% of their annual revenue would be paid up to the 2% threshold, right? So if you had not in either of the previous phases received up to 2% of your annual revenue, phase three for most got you up to that 2% threshold. But also there was a factor of distributions up to 88% of reported losses. If you had already received 88% of reported losses, that pretty much created a limitation for you. But again, if you have not gotten phase 3 funding yet and you put your application in, all is not lost. As I said, we have quite a few providers that have not received that yet. I would say it would behoove you to touch base with them just to make sure that the applications are still active and that they are working on that. But I do know that they've had some challenges in getting all of those phases or all the funding in phase 3 paid out. Chad, you want to go to the next phase or next page? So all right, so we talked about general distributions. Let's talk about targeted distributions. And targeted is for very specific sub providers, right? So in other words, COVID-19 high impact areas, those hospitals in high impact areas, rural health providers. These are specific distributions designed for a niche area, in this case, rural healthcare providers or skilled nursing facilities and nursing homes. They got a special targeted distribution. The SNFs also got a targeted distribution to enhance infection control. We all saw in the press, in the media, about how skilled nursing facilities and nursing homes were just, petri dishes for COVID. And so one of the things that the targeted distribution was designed to do is to provide enhanced infection control and to get that under control. Also Indian Health Services, tribal and urban Indian health programs, and then safety net hospitals. So we're going to talk in a little while. Chad will discuss how general distributions versus targeted distributions, how those can actually be handled within a consolidated organization if you have a parent and several subsidiaries, how you can move those monies around, the general versus targeted, but also how you have to report those, right? Because there are different reporting requirements if it's a general distribution versus a targeted distribution. So stay tuned for that, and we'll touch on that in just a little bit. Chad? So timing. What are we talking about timing? I will tell you, every month there for a while, it seemed like, or every other month, it seemed like they were changing the rules of the game. We went through, and I'm sure everybody feels the same. It was quite the moving target, as it were, as to what you were supposed to report, how you were supposed to report it. The first few months, April and May, mostly was just the distribution of the funds, right? The first round and the second round of phase 1, and then you started having some of the targeted distributions in May. Then we get to June, and June, we started in phase 2 and also with a couple of other targeted distributions. But then we get to that last bullet where the instructions were issued for determining justification of funds. So that's when they first started addressing how do you account for those funds. And this is where the lost revenue calculation using net patient service revenue was introduced. And that was for the period from March to April, right? Because everybody at the time thought, well, March and April, that's pretty much, going to cover this thing, and we're going to be coming out of it here in the summer of 20. We obviously did not do that, but that was what the anticipation was in June. So they were just looking at lost revenue for the period from March to April. And also included in those instructions were, the accounting and examples of incremental expenses, things like that. So then we moved to July. In July, we go, okay, we're going to have some more targeted distributions. We'll get into August, again, continuing with the targeted distributions, nursing homes, children's hospitals, some more nursing homes. And then here comes September. And this is where things got interesting. The last bullet, the new instructions were issued for determining the justification of funds. So they changed the game on us. It's like I've often said, this is almost like building the airplane while you're flying it, right? It's just you're literally building things on the fly here. In this case, they came out and said, well, you know what? We reconsidered the lost revenue, and now we want to say you have to calculate it based on your net profit or loss. So in other words, what was your net profit or loss to determine how much should be allocated to justifying the provider relief funds, rather than the net patient service revenue. And that was to be calculated on the calendar year, not March and April. So we got into September, and now things are not looking quite so rosy as they had hoped in June. So now we're starting to extend that calculation period out from just those initial 2 months into the calendar year. So now that resulted in a significant challenge for a lot of providers, because that revised lost revenue calculation created significant erosions in the justification for the use of the provider relief funds when we moved to the net profit or loss, because honestly, we had done a good job of containing costs, so your net profit and loss wasn't that bad, but your lost revenue still was bad. So then we go to October, so we get into the final quarter of the year. So as you'll see, we continue to have some more distributions. Now we're announcing that phase 3 is coming around, doing a few more targeted distributions. And then November arrives. And now we get into another set of instructions. And lo and behold, I think they probably got a lot of pushback from everyone on that net profit or loss calculation, and it resulted in going back to basing it on net patient service revenue, but still for the calendar year, right? They did not revert back to the March and April. They kept the calendar year, but they just changed it to net patient service revenue. And then also they did clarify that capital expenses can actually be included to the amount that was actually paid, versus what from an accounting perspective would be just the annual depreciation. So they were giving some benefits to the providers in the fact that they could include the entire amount of the purchase of the capital expenses versus just the annual depreciation. So then we get to finally in December of 20, and this has pretty much been the end of it as far as any type of guidance from HHS on what to do with provider relief funds. Had, again, more nursing home payments. They started with the phase 3 distributions. And at the end of the year, I think it was around December 27th, the bill was passed and signed into law that reverts lost revenue calculations back to the June instructions. So if you remember what we were talking about in June, there were 3 options: actual to actual, actual to budget, or some other reasonable methodology. Keeping in mind that an other reasonable methodology, depending on what that is, other reasonable methodology is definitely going to probably result in a higher audit scrutiny on the part of what you're using. But depending on what you're using, and I think Chad will probably get into this in a little bit, depending on your risk that you're taking on by using the other reasonable methodology, you may be okay, or it may be a lot riskier depending on what is involved in your other reasonable methodology, and that might create some issues for you if it's rejected. But again, I'll let Chad talk about a little bit more of that. Also, the FAQs in January of 2021 indicated that the period to be used for the calculation is still the calendar year, right? They did not. It's interesting. They reverted back to June, which, if you remember, in the June instructions, it said March and April, but the frequently asked questions issued in January of 2021 superseded that and says that it is in fact the calendar year. So a lot to keep in mind. You can see, again, how things have progressed over the last year and a half. But Chad, I think I'm going to let you take over and start talking about, what are we doing as far as how do we account for it and how do we report it?
All right. Thank you, Vincent.
Mm-hmm.
So we'll start talking about reporting here. So for many months, obviously, the healthcare organizations have been getting this money, been trying to appropriately use it and prepare for reporting that was supposed to start in January 15th of 2021. Well, due to that coronavirus response and relief Supplemental Appropriations Act of 2020, new guidance was issued that postponed that reporting period. So the portal did open January 15th, but only for registration purposes, not for reporting. The reporting was put off at that point in time, and as of today, there's still no date out there as to when reporting will start. What's important to note here is that healthcare providers, if they have not already done that, should be going to that portal and registering. And the other important point to know here is if all the funds have not been used up as of the end of 2020, they still have right now they have till the end of June 2021 to use that. So they have another 6-month period to utilize those funds. Subject to change, of course, when new guidance comes out. We don't know if they'll extend that period or not. But as of right now, we're at the June 30th, 2021. Where you have to report, use, and then report that information. So when we're talking about the use of funds, first of all, the reporting of it is going to be based on the healthcare organization's method of accounting, whether it's cash or accrual basis. That's how they're going to report their information. They are going to report their healthcare-related expenses attributable to coronavirus. And it really comes out to be their incremental expenses. So if there's another source that's obligated to pay for that, that will have to be taken against those funds before we look at PRF payments going towards them. So we identify our healthcare-related expenses first, and then if after taking all other reimbursement sources away from it, and then applying the provider relief fund amount to it, if that is fully expended, if all your PRF funds are fully expended, then obviously you would be done. But if not, then you can take the rest of that towards patient care loss revenue. And we'll talk about what that is here shortly. You do have to, important note to understand here is even if you do expend all of your funds on expenses, you do still need to report your patient care per HHS. So healthcare-related expenses, let's kind of jump into those and what those are. So those, again, are expenses that are related to expenses to prevent, prepare, or respond to coronavirus. And it's the amounts that is left after other sources of reimbursement have been applied to it. So that would take into account payment received from insurance or federal, state, local governments. And then after those funds have been netted against it, then the provider relief fund can be used to pay for those expenses. So just to chat briefly here on other assistance received. So you can see here, this is what HHS kind of outlines there: Treasury, Small Business Administration. That's a paycheck protection program. And what we're kind of recommending here is really you kind of segregate the funds for the Paycheck Protection Program and the expenses that you're going to be using for those funds to cover, segregate that from the COVID-19 incremental expenses. So if you do that and there's none of those in the expenses that you are reporting, then that possibly may be something that you won't have to report as other assistance. If you're eligible for FEMA, you're going to report that as other assistance. CARES Acting, so if you're getting reimbursement for CARES Act testing, that would be a piece of assistance that would be netted against those funds. If you get any of the coronavirus relief fund, which is coming from the local, state, or tribal government sources. And you've got those expenses as part of your COVID expenses. You'll need to net that against that. If you had business insurance that paid for business interruption that didn't exclude a pandemic, and you made a claim, that claim would also be taken against that, that as other assistance before you applied the provider relief funds. As far as the expense categories, important to note here is these are expenses that are incremental COVID-19 expenses. So you're going to be looking at it to calculate that. You're not going to look at total expenses. You're going to look at expenses within these different categories. And once you see the increases in those, you'll determine if those were attributable to COVID-19. And that's what your expenses, your healthcare related expenses would be. Now there's two different types of categories for reporting. One is if you received more than 10,000 and less than 500,000, you really only have to report in that G&A expense category and healthcare related expense category. If you got more than $500,000, then you got to do a little bit more in-depth reporting along those different different categories that we're talking about there. And again, we're looking at the increased incremental expenses in these areas. So just kind of taking a brief look at a few of those. Mortgage and rent. So that would be increased expenses that you're incurring, that you got another building, you rented a tent and sent it up outside, those type of things that are being used for COVID and were not around before COVID. Jumping up to fringe benefits. What are fringe benefits? That's something that supplements your existing payroll. Hazard pay would be something that would be part of that. Travel reimbursement would be part of that. Another big question is what's personnel expenses? Personnel expenses would be things that are being done again because of COVID. Workforce training, additional staffing you had to put in place, contractors, additional contractors, and you have to kind of look at those that personnel in the kind of the salary category and the hourly category. In that salary category, that's something that you're going to have been experiencing no matter what. So that salary category is a little bit different, and you're just looking again at things like hazard pay that would have been paid for that. If they just got moved, a salary person got moved from one place to another without incurring any additional expenses, that wouldn't necessarily be counted as expenses in this area. Healthcare related expenses, the big one here is supplies. That's that additional PPE, additional hand sanitizers, things like that are over and above what you had before COVID. Information technology, if you expanded your footprint in IT for remote workforce or additional servers or telehealth, things like that. And then the other thing that really is important here to understand is equipment and facilities. What can we claim here? And really what we're looking at here is you can fully expense the expenditures of these capital type of expenses if they're bought for COVID related. That kind of went through some different changes throughout this process as to whether it was just depreciation or if you could include the entire expense. And right now we're kind of in that period where the entire expense can be expensed as long as it's for COVID related type of things. Some examples with that would be for a facility, HVAC, improving your HVAC system, retrofitting COVID units, reconfiguring patient intake so that you can keep COVID and non-COVID patients separate. So those are some of those things that you can look at in that capital category. When we talk about healthcare related lost revenue, not going to hit this too hard because Vincent kind of hit it as he was going through his slides there. But again, we've got three different things you can look at here. The difference between 2019 and 2020 actual, the difference between 2020 budget, in 2020 actual, and that reasonable method of estimating revenue. And there's nuances under each one of those that have to be kind of taken into account. The big thing with budget is you have to make sure you're using a budget that was pre-COVID. So they put March 27th, 2020 as the date that you can, that budget had to be approved and ratified by the CFO or CFO. And then, as Vincent mentioned, that reasonable method of estimating revenue is something that will be scrutinized a little bit more. HRSA will take a look at that. They'll notify you if it's a reasonable method or not. And if not, they'll tell you it's not, and you'll have 30 days to resubmit your information based on either the actual to actual or the budgeted to actual. And again, as Vincent mentioned earlier, this is for the full year. You have to look at, no matter what method you're using, you have to look at the full year 2020 compared to 2019, or the full year budget compared to actual. It's not just a few months that you look at there. Again, you can look at the healthcare related lost revenue in these 6 months that we're in right now. And depending on what methodology is being utilized, if you're using the actual, you're going to look at 2019 quarter one and quarter two to 2021 quarter one and quarter two actual. If you're looking at the budgeted, that'd be the 2020 quarter one, quarter two to the 2021 quarter one and quarter two actual. One thing that's been kind of an issue throughout this is what really is the definition of healthcare related revenue. So HHA says what they're looking at is net patient service revenue from the delivery of healthcare service directly to patient care. So what you start with is gross charges for patient services, and that would include fundraising, grants, and donations if they're for a patient care area. So that's all part of your gross charges, and then you would subtract from that contractual adjustments, charity care adjustments, bad debt adjustments. So that's that number you're going to compare your 2019 actual to 2020 is that net patient revenue after you've calculated it through this process. One of the things with the healthcare related lost revenue that you have to take into account is you do have to report that by payer. So you will have to take the time and split that out between Medicare Part A, Medicare Part C, Medicaid, commercial insurance. So that's part of when you report this in the portal. When that opens, you'll have to have that information available as you report your revenue, your net patient revenue in that payer mix. So one thing to remember here is,
hey, Chad,
so we've talked about.
I was going to say real quick for you, Chad, we got a quick question about prior year audit adjustments. So I thought cost report adjustments. So I thought you might want to touch on that real quick with the lost revenue.
What about cost report adjustments for prior year?
You know, the 19 and 20 versus non-19 and 20.
Yeah, so the cost report adjustments are not patient care service revenue. So those wouldn't be, if you have an adjustment to Medicare bad debts or something along those lines, those are not patient care revenue. So those wouldn't be taken into account.
I was thinking of settlements, actually. The settlements, the fiscal year 19 and 20 settlements versus non-fiscal year, or related to patient care outside of fiscal year 19 and 20. I think.
So if we're talking about a supplemental payment?
No, I was talking about, for example, and I don't know if this is exactly what they're referring to with cost report adjustments, but I know prior year settlements, if they relate to patient care outside of fiscal year 20 or 19, they're not included.
They would not be included. Yes,
but
exactly.
If they are related to fiscal year 19 or 20, they would be. If you wouldn't really have a prior year settlement in 20, but yes, if that's what they're referring to, cost report settlements.
Yeah, and I think what just an instant of time, feel free to shoot me an email on that question, and we can talk more about that. Whoever answered that question. Want to turn it over to Carla to talk about the single audit, but a couple other things to think about as you get ready to do your reporting is, 3 other metrics that you have to have ready: personnel metrics, and that's all your employees; patient metrics, that's patient visits, patients admitted, resident patients; and then facility metrics. And those are outlined more in the guidance, but those are additional things that came out that you have to be ready to report into the portal. So just beware of that. And again, we'll if you have that additional questions, if we didn't get that answered on what Vincent were talking about, feel free to contact me, and we'll talk more about that. And we'll right now turn it over to Carla to talk about the single audit requirements.
Thanks, Chad. You can move ahead to the next slide. Okay, so more entities are now going to be subject to a yellow book or a single audit. There will be entities that exceed the $750,000 threshold that never have done that in the past. So this year and next year, some organizations are going to be experiencing a yellow book or a single audit for the first time. And for this presentation, you may hear me use the terms a yellow book or government auditing standards or GAGAS used interchangeably. Inherently, there's increased risk for those entities that haven't had to experience those audits or compliance requirements before. Therefore, entities are going to have to become educated on the programs and the funds that they do receive. There's also an increased risk due to the federal agency guidance continuously being updated, as Vincent had mentioned. As many of you know, HHS has changed their position and their guidance many times now, and that can cause increased risk that something may be missed. So entities should keep a close lookout for resources that are available that could help them become more familiar with the continuous guidance as it comes out. So single audits for year ends prior to 12/31/20, there was some concerns over the timing of these audits. So for your 6/30/20 and your 9/30/20 year ends, they've been on hold. They were on hold until the latest compliance supplement addendum was issued back in December. And we're going to go through some of the compliance supplement addendum contents. The addendum also included information on the timing of the audits for the Provider Relief Fund, so we'll go over that in a little while. Next slide. So here's where we come to a fork in the road on exactly what type of audit is conducted and for what type of entities they're required. So nonprofit and governmental organizations will have a single audit or a program-specific audit performed if they meet certain criteria and if they met the $750,000 threshold. However, an option is presented for for-profit entities. Another option is presented for for-profits who receive the provider relief funds. So a for-profit entity can elect to have a single audit, or they can elect to have something called a financial audit in accordance with government auditing standards of their HHS awards. So there's a section in the HHS guidance, which is specifically 45 CFR 75, and that requires commercial organizations that receive HHS awards of $750,000 or more to have an audit. And that's where those two options are presented. Also, for-profits may be able to choose to have a program-specific audit if the criteria warrants it, and we're going to talk about all of these options. Next slide. So we're going to start with the single audit. So this is a very important slide because it discusses the timing of audits specifically for the Provider Relief Fund. It goes over some of the timing nuances for 93-498. And I do want to emphasize that this table only addresses the single audits and only addresses CFDA 93-498, the Provider Relief Fund. None of the other CFDAs are related to this chart. So fiscal years ending prior to 12/31/20, so that's mostly our 6/30/20s and 9/30/20 year ends, provider relief funds will not be reported on those CFAs. Instead, those amounts expended in fiscal years prior to 12/31/20 will be reported on next year's fiscal year CFA. So they won't be subject to single audit until next year. So let's take an example. If you have a 6/30/20 year-end organization that expended PRF during fiscal year 20, those expenditures will not be reported on the 6/30/20 CFA and instead will be reported on the 6/30/21 CFA. So let's talk about the 12/31/20 year ends. So organizations should include the provider relief funds on the 12/31/20 CFA. These aren't being bumped forward to a later CFA. They go on the CFA for the period they expended the funds. The amounts that go on the CFA for PRF are the healthcare related expenses incurred plus the lost revenue due to COVID. So these amounts are actually driven by what the entity will be reporting to HHS in the portal through the period through 12/31/20. And obviously the portal has not opened yet, but just remember that when those amounts are ultimately reported on the portal, those are the amounts that should be reflected on the CFA in the single audit. And I know on the last line you see some question marks, and that is the uncertainty at this time for 6/30/21 year ends and after, because at that time additional guidance will be provided that speaks about those year ends. Next slide. So now let's discuss the deadlines for the single audit. So generally speaking, the uniform guidance requires the single audit to be completed within 9 months of the entity's year end. However, due to COVID, there have been extensions granted. Originally, the addendum confirmed the original due dates from October 1st, 2020 through June 30th, 2021 would have a 3-month extension if the entity received COVID funding. However, just recently on March 19th, the OMB issued the memo M2120, which instructs the federal awarding agencies to allow recipients and subrecipients that have not yet filed their single audits as of March 19th, an extension for up to 6 months beyond the normal due date. And that applies to fiscal years through June 30th, 2021. So this memo does supersede the 3-month extension allowed under the addendum, and it also removes the restriction of the extension to only those entities who received COVID funding. So now it's available to all entities. Next slide. So here's just a visual representation of the original due date versus the new 6-month extended due date. Next slide. And this just continues onward all the way up through June 30th, 2021. So let's talk about when do we have an award. So only awards during the fiscal audit year should be considered for the CFA. So typically, you don't have an award to begin spending until all contracts are signed and completed. However, the pandemic caused crisis protocol. So what does that mean? It means that the provider relief funds were distributed and then companies had 90 days to accept the funds and agree to the terms. So this language in the addendum specific to PRF helps with the determination that these are awards, but sometimes in general it's not so clear cut since entities may not have a signed document. So we do, we're finding that some entities are struggling with the determination of what belongs on the CFA. So we've included on this slide some links that might be helpful for those entities. Next slide. So when an entity has received COVID-related funding, the expenditures should be separately listed on the CFA, even if they're part of the current program that also has non-COVID funds. So here's an example showing with TANF. Another point to consider in the reporting is if you do have a finding on a program that's related to COVID funding, the finding description should also include the COVID identification for those audit findings. Next slide. So the addendum also added new disclosure requirements to the CFA for donated personal protective equipment received. This amount can be marked unaudited, but it must be included in the entity's notes. And information related to this can be found in Part 8, Appendix 7 of the addendum. In addition, for the companies for year ends between 12/31/20 to 6/29/21, the CFA disclosures must also document which amounts are based upon the 12/31/20 PRF report that was submitted to HHS. Next slide. Because we've been waiting on guidance for the COVID funding auditing procedures and the supplement for PRF, many organizations have issued their financial statement audit prior to the single audit, or they may want to issue their 12/31/20 audits prior to the single audit. So here are a couple of key points to consider when that option is selected. So an important consideration is when the single audit takes place, the auditor has the responsibility to consider compliance with laws and regulations in the financial statement audit under the Yellow Book guidance. Therefore, although the Yellow Book opinion is included in the single audit package, we still have to sign that opinion the same date as the original GAAP report and ensure before the release of those GAAP financials that we've assessed the internal control over financial reporting. There is also a requirement if the single audit is issued subsequent to the GAAP audit, we would have to consider subsequent events that occurred up to the single audit date. And this also goes for the audit committee communication. Even if the original communication was made prior to the release of the GAAP report, we have to ensure that another communication is done when the single audit is issued later than 60 days from the financial statement date. Next slide. So now we're going to turn our attention to the program-specific audit. This type of audit is an option under the single audit that can be performed only if certain criteria are met. So when an auditee expends federal awards under only one federal program, and just to note, this doesn't include the R&D cluster, and the federal award does not require a financial statement audit of the auditee may elect to have a program-specific audit. So a program-specific audit is a possible election of for-profits or nonprofits for which the Provider Relief Fund is their only federal program. So this is another reason why it's so imperative that the CFA be complete and the CFDA numbers be included, that are included on the CFA be accurate. Because if you have more than one CFDA, you cannot perform a program-specific audit. So because there's so much information, as you can see, when it comes to the single audit and the Provider Relief Fund, we created this slide which includes links to different guidance that you could visit. So these are websites that we recommend that you visit. So next we're going to discuss the compliance requirements as it pertains to the Provider Relief Fund. So we wanted to take some time to discuss the document that assists auditors in performing compliance audits. And that document is the compliance supplement, which identifies the important compliance requirements that the government expects auditors to address. The use of the compliance supplement is an efficient way for auditors to understand the federal programs and the audit procedures. So the latest version of the compliance supplement was issued in August 2020, which applies to organizations for year ends June 30th, 2020 and after. Overall, the August compliance supplement doesn't really address specific COVID programs. So on December 22nd, the OMB issued an addendum to the compliance supplement, and this addendum is updated for COVID-19 federal programs and already existing federal programs that may have changed due to COVID-19. Next slide. So as mentioned, part 2 of the compliance supplement addendum has the matrix, which provides specific areas that the auditor will be testing for specific programs. So this table or matrix you see is taken directly from the addendum, and this indicates which compliance requirements are applicable to 93-498 and which will be tested. And you'll see there are 3 that are required to be tested, which have the yes below them. And that's activities allowed, allowable costs, and reporting. This slide lists the different types of distributions made under the PRF, like general and targeted. The addendum provides links to the PDF terms and conditions for each type of distribution, and it should be used as a resource to understand the costs that are allowable. So when you look at the compliance supplement details, you'll also notice there are some differences between allowable costs for the skilled nursing facility infection control distribution and the other distributions. So just be aware of that. So the other area of compliance auditors are required to test is reporting. And this is a summary of the reporting compliance requirements specific to PRF. As you know, HHS issued a general and targeted distribution post-payment notice of reporting. And the addendum clearly states that auditors must test the report into the portal for 12/31/2020 year ends and after. However, they have been put on hold. So auditors cannot do that test until the portal opens. An additional audit reporting test that's required is related to the Federal Funding, Accountability, and Transparency Act. Under this act, direct recipients of federal grants who make first-tier subawards of $25,000 or more are required to register in the subaward reporting system, and the auditor is required to test these reporting requirements if the organization makes first-tier subawards greater than $25,000. So we just discussed the single audit, and now we're going to touch briefly upon the financial audit in accordance with GAGAS. So the terms and conditions that came out from HHS stated that for-profits who received $750,000 or more could obtain a financial related audit in accordance with GAGAS. However, there's still many uncertainties about this audit that the GAQC has sent questions about to HHS, and currently these questions are pending. So one of the questions is if the $750,000 threshold that triggers an audit is based on receipts or expenditures. Under the single audit, it's based on expenditures, but the HHS FAQs uses the word receipts. So that's an outstanding question. The appropriate financial reporting framework is also outstanding. The disclosure requirements, the timing of the expenditures and lost revenue and how they'll be reported is also a question. And lastly, the audit deadline is not clear yet for that audit. What the AICPA is fairly certain of is that this audit option will be conducted by the auditors under section AUC 805. When this is the case, the auditor is able to apply relevant financial reporting guidance to the statement. However, it is still management of the organization's responsibility to prepare the statement. So here we have a draft example provided by GAQC to HHS on what might be acceptable as a statement under this option. So you'll see it's a statement of costs and lost revenue for HHH funds, and each federal CFDA number for HHS is in its own line and reports the amount of expenditures and lost revenue for the period. So potential disclosures to this statement are also listed on the right. And again, these are only draft disclosures and they've been submitted to HHS by the AICPA for their review. So that concludes our presentation. Thank you everyone who's joined us today. Chad, I didn't know if you had anything additional or if there were any pending questions.
Chad, you're on mute. We can't hear what you're saying, Chad.
Yeah, you're on mute.
Oh, sorry about that.
There you go.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
I just want to say if there are questions, I think most know how to get a hold of me. If not, let Jessica know and she can get you that information. We're happy to answer any questions that may come out based on this brief highlight, and happy to talk more in depth about it.
Great. Well, thank you, Vincent, Chad, and Carla for your time and expertise. This was very good information, good discussion. Reminder to all attendees that the event will remain open for networking and visiting with our sponsors. The sponsor password game cards are due at noon tomorrow, so be sure to stop by our sponsors and fill out the game card to be eligible for prizes. We're also going to be having a fun networking event tonight at 5 p.m. with games and trivia. Anyone can join, and you're welcome. Thank you all for being here, and have a good rest of the conference.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.